Thank you, Fanny. So our next topic will be very recent in the gaming world and already touched when we speak about basically the economy around esports. It will be about the loot boxing and gambling, and a very, very professional man will present you this. He's a professor of behavior addiction at the Nottingham Trent University. He's been researching on gambling and gaming for the last 30 years and published over 70 papers, 5 books, 150 book chapters, and over 1,000 articles in the topic. So please welcome Dr. Mark D. Griffiths.
Okay, thank you for that. I just want to correct one thing there. I've actually published 730 papers, not 70. People say that I'm addicted to publishing papers. That's actually the best addiction that you can have in academia. Anyway, what I'm going to do today, if you've heard me speak before, you'll probably know I speak at 1 of 3 speeds, which is fast, very fast, and on amphetamines. I'm going to speak slowly today for the benefit of the simultaneous translators. As I say, I've been researching in the area of gambling and gaming now for 31 years. More recently, I've been looking at things like esports. I was one of the authors on the review that Fanny was just talking about just now. One of the interesting things from my perspective is that I was one of the people, just as a declare of a conflict of interest, I was on the World Health Organization party that got video game addiction recognized as a mental disorder, which some of you may be booing me now for that. Can I just say that I am not anti-gaming in the slightest, but of course in our professional work we come across a small minority of individuals who do seem to become addicted to video games in the same way that other people become addicted to things like drugs and alcohol. In my work on esports, I've written 2 papers where I've actually argued that esports players who are addicted to video games are not actually addicted to video games, they're actually addicted to work because that is their job rather than playing them for entertainment purposes. Anyway, as I say, one of the things that I'm most known for is my work on what's called gambling and gaming convergence. I published my first paper noting the similarities between gambling and gaming way back in 1990. And I was criticized quite heavily at the time for calling video gaming a non-commercial form of gambling. One of the things I was always trying to argue that there are many psychological and behavioral similarities between video game players and gamblers, and that really the only difference between those 2 groups is that gamblers used money as a way of keeping score, whereas video gamers actually used the scores that they were getting during their game. What we've got now, of course, is this media convergence, and we're seeing lots of examples of gambling within video games. We've got lots of examples of video gaming within gambling-type games. We now, of course, have got gambling and video gaming via things like social networking sites. These are both commercial operators that have now put gambling actually part of things like Facebook, so games like Bingo Frenzy that was introduced back in 2012. But there are also lots of what I would call gambling-type games, things like Slots Mania, Texas Hold'em Poker, that people can play through social networking sites like Facebook. And although people are not gambling for money, I've argued, particularly when children are playing it, is they are behaviorally and socially conditioned to have gambling-like experiences. And this might have an impact in terms of their gambling experiences in the future. And in fact, one of the findings that's come out consistently in my work and others' work is that when you look at adolescent gambling particularly, the #1 risk factor now for problem gambling is having played gambling-like games for free before people actually started playing for money. So I've been asked today, Fanny invited me to come here today, so my talk is not about esports in general, it's about, very specifically about loot boxes. I have to admit to you that I only came across the term loot boxes about 6 or 7 months ago. I had written previously in some of my papers about gambling-type games within online games like RuneScape, so things like Squeal of Fortune and Treasure Hunter, which I think are very conceptually and psychologically similar to loot boxes. So obviously I'm sure most people in the room know that loot boxes involve the buying of something where I would consider virtual games of chance. That already, using that phrase virtual games of chance, aligns it to me with the kind of psychology of gambling. Players are actually obviously using real money to buy these virtual in-game items, and players can actually redeem those items by buying keys to open boxes, which they then obviously have this chance selection of further virtual items. Now again, if you look at the kind of trade press, and when they talk about loot boxes, they talk about virtual items being won. Okay, so when you're talking about winning, again, that kind of aligns you to this idea that there are some kind of conceptual similarities with gambling. Obviously, in terms of the kinds of things you can win on by opening up loot boxes, it can be very simple things like, obviously aesthetic things to change the clothing on your character, through to some things that people find very valuable in terms of improving their gameplay. And of course, now we've got games, and there was a big furore with things like Star Wars Battlefront, where people were saying that we've spent a lot of money buying this game, and now you're basically forcing us to buy loot boxes so that we can actually continue playing the game. And a lot of people thought that was a very exploitative thing to do. And I would argue that loot boxes from some of the manufacturers that put it in their games, I do think they are potentially exploitative, basically getting people to spend money that they shouldn't really be doing in the first place. Obviously, in terms of loot boxes, people are trying to win those rarer items, things that will actually help them progress in the game that they're playing. I would also note on the research that I've done, there does seem to be a lot of encouragement from the developers themselves to get people to buy more and more loot boxes. And again, there's a very fine line between what I would call customer enhancement and customer exploitation, but I do think that some gaming operators kind of go into that more exploitative side rather than the kind of customer enhancement side. So in short, and as a psychologist, people are actually obviously paying with real money to actually have an exchange for what I've put here as a completely random in-game item. And again, I think there are similarities between the definitions of gambling and the buying of loot boxes. Now again, I'm a psychologist, and I wish I'd written this quote, but this is a quote from Jamie Madigan, who's an American psychologist, and I just want to quote from this. He says, "Whenever you open a loot box, you might get something awesome, or you might get trash. This randomness taps into some of the very fundamental ways that our brain work when trying to predict whether or not a good thing will actually happen. We are particularly excited by unexpected pleasures like an epic skin for our character. This is because our brains are trying to pay attention to and trying to figure out such awesome rewards. But unlike in the real world, these rewards can be completely random, and we can't predict randomness, but that reward system in your brain doesn't know that. So what Jamie Madigan is trying to argue here is that we're kind of hardwired to get these kind of risky and rewarding experiences that are, that get our serotonin levels up, that get our dopamine going, and the brain, because of the reward is unpredictable, is that this can lead to habitual behavior. And we found this both in my work on things like video game addiction and on gambling addiction as well. So I actually was, for 15 years, before I was a professor of behavioral addiction, I spent 15 years as the world's only professor of gambling studies. It was a particularly nice USP to have at the time, but my work didn't just involve gambling, and it covers a lot of what we call behavioral addictions. But I think when we go back to having to, as a psychologist and as an academic, we always have to be very precise in terms of how we define a particular activity. Now, when it comes to gambling, there is actually no universal definition that people agree what gambling actually involves, but I think there's a number of common overlaps. So the first one here, as I said, that it's an exchange that is determined on a future event, which at the time of actually staking that money or actually staking something of financial value, the outcome is unknown. I think this is the case in loot boxes. The result is determined at least partly by chance. Again, I would argue that's the case in loot boxes. The losses incurred can be avoided by simply not taking part in the behavior in the first place. Again, I think loot boxes fit that particular criterion. Then I've also added here is it could be argued, and I think when people are paying loot boxes and they open it and they get something which they didn't want, and the players themselves do not perceive very much as a kind of value item, is that I've said here is that if the prize when you're actually doing an activity is less than the money you've actually paid, then for me that would also constitute a form of gambling. So based on these elements and these criteria when we define gambling, I think that loot boxes are a form of gambling. And as I say, I've written other papers where I've looked at mini games within things like RuneScape, so as I say, things like Squeal of Fortune and Treasure Hunter, which for me are definitely forms of gambling and which I wrote about back in 2014 and 2015. In the UK, where I'm from, esports is a very hot topic at the moment, and loot box is also a hot topic. Towards the end of last year, the Gambling Commission in the UK, they produced a big report that looked at lots of different types of activity, including esports. And again, I just want to quote from this particular report that was published in 2017. the Gambling Commission said that the payment of a stake for the opportunity to win a prize, i.e. in-game items, determined at random bears a very close resemblance to playing of a gambling machine. Where there are readily accessible opportunities to cash in or exchange these awarded in-game items for money or money's worth, and I just want to stress there money's worth, so it doesn't have to be money itself, but it has to be something of financial value, those elements of the game are likely to be considered licensable gambling activities. Where prizes are successfully restricted for the use solely within the game, such in-game features would not normally be licensable for gambling, notwithstanding the elements of expenditure and chance. So what the Gambling Commission, using a kind of sleight of hand in terms of how they've worded things, they have considered that loot boxes are not a form of gambling, okay, because they claim the in-game items have absolutely no financial value outside of the game. They said that this is all done within the game, there's no money exchanging hand, therefore this is not gambling. However, I would argue that it's not just about what happens in-game, because I've argued in my writings is that these items do have financial value and people can trade them on various third-party sites. And obviously there are now many websites out there that allow players to trade in the things that they've got from playing on their video games. Now the UK Gambling Commission, they acknowledge that this point, that there are third-party sites out there that do allow the trading of items and that they are bought and sold for financial value. But as I say, their get-out clause is that the trading of these items doesn't actually happen within the game themselves, and therefore they are not licensable by the Gambling Commission themselves. Now again, you would expect this, but this is a quote from Dirk Bosmans from the Pan-European Game Information. Again, obviously a lot of the kind of gaming developers and operators, they are absolutely saying that loot boxes are not a form of gambling. And this quote here is very similar to lots of other quotes that you can find by those who are CEOs of various parts of the video game industry. They say that loot crates are currently not considered gambling. You will always get something when you purchase them, even if it's not what you want. For that reason, a loot crate system does not trigger the gambling content descriptor. And obviously, I was one of the people back in 1993 that actually got these descriptors on games in the first place. It's one of the things I'm most proud of in my academic career. But Bosmans go on to say that therefore, the games that get a PEGI gambling content descriptor either contains content that simulates what is considered gambling, or they contain actual gambling with payout. Now, for me, I think this is a rather kind of hardline attitude to take, because I still think that, again, in terms of my definitions of gambling and what the criteria are for defining gambling, is that, you know, if you look in the kind of descriptor content relating to gambling, it does actually say that they will use the gambling kind of descriptor if any video game teaches or encourages gambling. And I would argue that loot boxes actually do that. And as I say, such a descriptor by PEGI, I think, does actually, even if they don't think it's technically gambling, I really don't think you couldn't argue it's not at least gambling-like. And therefore, I do think that PEGI should have a descriptor there. And again, if we look at what's happening in the world, and we saw one of the presentations this morning talking about the kind of regulation of this, we know, for instance, that places like Japan and China, they now do consider loot boxes as a form of gambling. There are places like Belgium and Australia at the moment that are actively considering loot boxes as a form of gambling. And there are a few jurisdictions, like myself in the UK, where they've absolutely stated that loot boxes are not a form of gambling by their license definitions. So we've got a situation at the moment. I think most countries haven't even considered at the moment whether loot boxes are an issue in terms of regulation or not yet. As I've said before, the UK is very clear at the moment. I'm obviously hoping to try and change their opinion of their view that loot boxes are a form of gambling, because at the moment it isn't the case. Sorry, it's the case that they don't believe that loot boxes are in any way actually, in terms of their criteria, meet the regulatory standards for being classed as a form of gambling. I'm one of the few people. I've got if you would like a copy of this paper, I published this a few months ago. This was, as I say, I'd never even heard of loot boxes until 6 or 7 months ago. I wrote this paper because everything that I was reading about loot boxes led me to the conclusion is that loot boxes are, at the very least, gambling-like, and could argue to be actually a form of gambling depending on which definition that you take. There are now loads and loads of articles in the trade press. I mean, that's one of the reasons it's become a hot issue in lots of countries, because of all the press publicity. But most of those articles do go on to say that the buying of loot boxes, even if it's not a form of gambling, is something that could be seen as potentially addictive, i.e. that people are doing it to the neglect of everything else in their life. One of the reasons as a psychologist I'm most interested in that is because if you look at the reward systems for things like slot machines and other forms of gambling, particularly what we call operant conditioning, where people are getting unpredictable rewards every so often, it's this type of activity that tends to lead to the very habitual playing of lots of activities, including gambling and gaming. So my final slide today is I'm trying to argue, at the very least, okay, I think most people would argue that loot boxes are at least gambling-like, okay? From my own personal position, I personally think that loot boxes are a form of gambling. I think because of the prizes that can be won in terms of financial terms, and the fact that you can open up a loot box and actually get something that's a lot lower than the financial price that you've paid for it, to me, means that it's a form of gambling. Obviously now we've got these third-party websites that continue to host services where people can trade the things that they've won via their loot box openings. This in and of itself means that there is a financial value to what is opened when you either win or some people perceive as losing in terms of the items that they get on a loot box. And for me, and I say, I'm just repeating what I've said before, my main conclusion is that I personally think that loot boxes are a form of gambling by almost any definition that we've come across. I'll leave it there and say thank you very much. Yeah, there's a question from the audience.
Some game publishers recently published that the rarity of the items that are included in the loot box. For example, how many chances do you have to receive an epic item in a loot box? What do you think of that? Does it have an impact or not?
Oh, the thing is, I personally think when you've got a really rare item, is that operators, just like in the gambling world, that players should be given the odds of actually winning that particular item. When we play the national lottery in our country, every player knows that there's a kind of 1 in 59 million chance of winning the big jackpot prize. I personally think, there's been a lot of talk in the gambling field about what we call responsible gambling, social responsibility, duty of care, player protection, harm minimization. I think that the video game industry can learn best practice from what's happening in the gambling industry, and that very issue of probability is something that players should absolutely know what the chances of winning the really rare items that you want, because that would probably stop people buying loot boxes in the first place if they knew how rare or how small the chances of winning were.
Thank you.
Yes, a question at the back there. Sorry, I'm finding it hard to see with the light shining in my face.
So, regarding this topic that you brought up in this conference, there are some real facts about some companies that could somehow grow a market also with exchanging of loot boxes or in-game purchases. So there are real facts about this. When there is a sort of discover about this topic, you find yourself trying to defeat the system or somehow to try to regulate the system, and you end up like you versus that company. So if you don't have the strength to go versus these companies, to come up with some sort of law that protects you when you go versus them, you find out that sometimes you have just to let it go. That's the question from the community gamers perspective.
Sorry, I didn't
Do you agree, or?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question you're asking.
So how can you somehow do something to fight this kind of systems that engross only the pockets of the game developers, and that's it? Also the esports as a sort of phenomenon, it's strictly related to what the game developers are trying to establish, and they should align to those rules. That's it. So
okay, I suppose from my perspective, and most of my work traditionally has come in the gambling world, and it's taken us decades to actually get to a point where regulation has actually, as I say, protected players and minimized harm. I think the issue of loot boxes is something that people like myself have to educate regulators Obviously, I'm not anti-gaming, I'm not anti-esports. People love playing these games. I've got 3 screenagers myself who all play vast amounts of video games. However, there are some of these more what I would call exploitative elements that should be regulated, and it's people like me that publish these academic papers that we then have got to get into a form that are understandable by the regulators, and for us to argue our point of why something like loot boxes, at the very least, is gambling-like. Even if we don't agree that something is gambling, is that it does take people in positions of expertise to actually educate those people who need to know. As I say, I've had a big debate for about the last 6 or 7 months with my own UK Gambling Commission at the moment. They often don't listen to me, but if there were 5 people like me all saying the same thing, I think that would start to change opinion. Unfortunately, in most countries, there are very few academics working in these areas, and therefore we get to the point it's always the same voice saying the same thing, and those people tend not to get listened to until you've got a kind of critical mass.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Something else? Sorry, I cannot see. I can't see at all over there.
Yeah, no worries. What's the story? What do you think we could do? What do you think the people could do to get this regulated as fast as possible? You know, we eventually got there with Peggy here in Europe and ERSB over there in the US regarding non-violence and non-sexualism and those kinds of things. But looking at gambling, I think it could be at least as damaging for the players as you know, violence in video games is. And obviously you're part of these discussions, you're on the forefront of all this. So what do you think we could do to speed up the process ourselves as players, as people, as developers, like people at this conference?
Well, again, what I've learned from my many, many years working in the gambling world, the more and more different types of stakeholders that are saying the same thing, regulation tends to follow it. So when you've got players, when you've got treatment providers, when you've got researchers and academics, when you've got policymakers, all saying that we think this is an issue of concern, things start to change. And if it comes from the industry itself, I think things will change incredibly quickly. When the gambling, the most responsible gambling operators have said to government, we want you to legislate on this, because it's actually going to affect bottom line profits, and people haven't got, that they will actually probably lose money from some of this, government tends to listen very, very quickly. So I think the video game industry would actually have the strongest voice in those particular sectors. But as I say, my own experience is the more and more different people who give the same message is likely to change regulation.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any more? No? Okay, happy to stop. I'll be in the coffee break at the break if you want to talk to me about that, but thank you very much.